This is
Okay.
Dennis Ramundi with Phil Goldberg, our guest today, Chogyal Rinpoche. And I wanted to ask you, Phil, which is the title? It's Tibetan Buddhism. He's a Tibetan Buddhist. And which is the title and which is the name?
Rinpoche is the title.
Okay,
There's a
what does
lot. There
Rinpoche
are a
mean?
lot of
Is it
there
a
are a lot
Lama?
of Rinpoches, and I just looked it up. Actually, I just knew it as a title. Kind of. I always thought of it as sort of the Tibetan equivalent of Swami or something like that. And according to the web, it's an honorific term that literally means precious one, and other it kind of like jewel or gem. But it's an honorific term usually associated with monks.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when I first heard about him from friends, they mentioned that, and he didn't get into all the detail today. At 5 years old, he was put into a monastery, but apparently the lamas or the monks of the monastery near them came and they saw certain signs in regard to maybe markings on his hands or feet, and then also they had him identify certain objects that apparently you could only know if you had some knowledge from a past life or whatever.
Mm.
Similar to how the Dalai Lama was discovered, and so from that very early age, he was in the monastery. I mean, a very interesting story.
Yeah, and one of the things we didn't ask was there. People think of Tibetan Buddhism; they naturally think of the Dalai Lama, but there are other lineages associated with Tibetan Buddhism, and I think he's from one of the others. And we didn't get those details, but anybody can look them up if they Google Chogyal Rinpoche and his BIA Foundation.
Yeah, it's BIA-foundation.org. He said that he was in the monastery for like 10 years. Then for 10 years or so, or several years after the monastery, he must have been probably when he was around 15, he went to study in a like a equivalent of a seminary, but for Buddhists, and he did that, and then he spent 3 years in meditation, and I've actually seen pictures of him way up in Tibet, in the or Nepal in the mountains, doing his meditation for, he said, for 3.5 years, and then from there, I guess he went back to the monastery, and he was very attracted to this idea of compassion and helping others, which seems to be
Yeah.
a theme that's coming up with more and more of the spiritual folks that we talk to from every tradition. That one must take that inner spirituality and bring it out and share it and help the world with it. So
Yeah, and he seems to be one of those people for whom that becomes essentially the principal focus of his path. Hence, that's why I asked him about the excuse me, the parallels with what we think of as karma yoga.
right.
But he's a very impressive guy. I mean, when you think of it, he's only 30 years old.
Right. He's very, very knowledgeable. He seemed to refer to different things that took place in Buddhism 600 years ago, 700 years ago, 2,500 years ago. So obviously he has quite a bit of scholarship. And then in
Yeah,
his journey to the U.S., he stopped at in Naropa, is it?
Naropa. Yeah,
Yeah, in Maharishi University where he learned TM, and then he was in Chicago, New York, and now up at Harvard where he has a friend or fellow monk who's getting a master's degree there, and so very interesting. And if you look at his website, they have an orphanage. They do a lot of very very good stuff for folks.
yeah. It's fascinating. It's very impressive. They have, as you said, an orphanage in Kathmandu. They have other charitable organizations in different parts of India and Tibet and other, and of course they were very active in the earthquake relief in Nepal presumably, after the recent earthquake there. So he's got his hands in a number of very worthwhile organizations, and seems to be quite a dynamo for a monk. But that's not that as unusual as people think, I guess.
Yeah.
There even if you think of the Catholic nuns in America, many of them live reclusive lives, and some of them run schools, and others are out there, working with the homeless and in
Right.
hospitals and so.
Yeah, he mentioned that he said his work was like missionary. The difference I think is in Christianity when they go out, they big part of it is converting people to Christianity,
Yeah,
whereas in
yeah,
Buddhism, I think Buddhism, like Hinduism, is more all-encompassing. I think a Buddhist probably feels a person could be practicing everything Buddhists should be practicing and still be a Christian or a Jew or
sure.
Muslim or whatever like that. So
Yeah,
it's fascinating stuff. The other thing I wanted to see if you could elaborate on a little, Phil, is and he touched upon it. You asked him about the difference between Tibetan and yeah, Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, and
yeah,
I've met Buddhists when I was in Cambodia, Buddhist monks, and in Thailand, and they all seem to have a slightly different flavor. What are some of the big distinctions, say, between Zen and Tibetan?
well, I'm not an expert on Buddhism. We should get one.
Right.
um, we had Dana Sawyer on, and Dana is a scholar who would be able to answer that question very with great understanding. But we didn't get into that. I do know some Buddhist scholars, so let's have one on. Or we can also get on people from other um, schools of Buddhism,
Right.
like Zen. We should find a good Zen teacher, and maybe one of the people who are from some of the lineages associated with Sri Lanka or Burma. They're all very different. And my understanding is it's just like any other spiritual or religious tradition when they go to other cultures. I mean, Buddha was in northern India. He was actually lived in the area not far from Nepal, what is now Nepal. And, he was a yogi from a princely Hindu family. And just like Jesus was a Jew.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
now they end up, being separate religions over the course of history. But, as Buddha's teachings went to other parts of Asia, as he said, it takes on the character of those cultures.
Right.
And so, in Japan, they adopted the Buddhism that took root in China. And by the time it matured in Japan, it became what we call Zen. And, that's a very austere and sort of minimalist tradition, which is, I guess, in keeping with the Japanese culture.
Yeah.
And
Phil, I was just thinking it's not unlike if you go to Italy and you go to a Christian church, usually it's a Catholic church, very ornate, very decorative
right,
statues, painting. If you go to a Christian church, usually let's say Lutheran in Scandinavia, it's very simple, very plain, very minimalistic. And so I think, probably not unlike the differences between Tibetan and Zen Buddhisms, the trappings. Also, what I asked Phil, in the United States now, one of the fastest growing religions I've read is Buddhism. A lot of people are starting to, consider themselves Buddhist, and I'm wondering if you're we've talked about this also. If you're spiritual but not religious, and you do want to be religious, the easiest, maybe one of the easier religions to become is Buddhist because you don't
yeah.
have all the dogma and all associated with some of the other religions.
Yeah. And, I think if you look at the spiritual but not religious uh, demographic, I would predict that if you broke it down and you looked at what people are actually doing, if they're serious about their spiritual life, but they don't identify with any particular religion, but they have practices and they have a philosophical or theological perspective, it's usually what we would think of as Hindu or Buddhist,
Mm-hmm.
because they're learning from they may be learning from all the different traditions, including the one they were brought up in, but they probably have in most cases, they're either practicing some form of meditation that derives from Hindu or Buddhist tradition, or they're yogis, they're doing hatha yoga, or they're practicing mindfulness, which comes from Buddhist teachings, because those teachings lend themselves to being adopted by people with various belief systems and so forth. And to get back to a previous point you made, the whole history of missionaries going to Asia and Africa to convert people is a very controversial one, because a lot of the ones who go don't have that missionary zeal to convert people. They're just doing like Rinpoche is doing. They were just doing service, treating the sick and opening schools. But a lot of them are doing, it's tied to conversion. And sometimes it's gotten so distasteful and corrupt that, they'll help you with money and food and medicine only if you convert. And that's kind of a shameful thing. But the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there's not even a concept of conversion. It's just not part of the tradition at all. There's no equivalent. It's just never done.
Right. No, I've seen it up close in some of my travels with the missionaries. Most are just wanting to help people, but there are those that are there. You convert, you become one of us, and that's really their underlying motivation. That's all they really care about, and I think that is unfortunate. But I think most are not like that, and certainly those coming from the Buddhist tradition.
Right, and
like our guest today
I'm
would not.
familiar with that phenomenon in India, because when I've been to India, I get a lot of people who are very upset by some of the tactics being used by missionaries, and it's a controversial thing, especially in the last couple of decades. There's a concerted effort funded by conservative fundamentalists in the U.S. to harvest souls, essentially, and it's a big numbers game, and it's heavily funded. And some of the tactics that are being used would embarrass any good Christian. But as you say, it's a small minority, but they're very, very active.
Right.
And other missionaries are, usually welcome and respected. But that's been a long history.
No, I think their attitude should just be they should just go there and help, and people should be inspired by their example, and then if they choose to follow their path, they could do it and not be like going over there being salesmen or brokers. We'll give you this if you believe that or whatever. But anyway,
back to Rinpoche's the interview. It was rather surprising that he had spent time in Iowa learning TM of all things. I didn't expect to hear that from a Tibetan Buddhist visiting the U.S., but it was kind of fascinating.
Yeah, he's going around looking at everything, and he had a great time. He interacted with the David Lynch Foundation, which we're both very familiar with, and the work they're doing. And I think it's a good outreach, and I think he will continue to visit communities in the United States and elsewhere, and hopefully bring different groups together that are all working for a common cause. Uplifting humanity. So very, very, very interesting fellow. And like you said, he's young. He's only about how old is he? 35.
And 30. He said he was born in 1985.
Wow. So he's 30 years old, and very established in his spiritual life, having been in a monastery since he's 5, and now I think just discovering the outer world and traveling and bringing a very good message. Again, his foundation can be found online at bia-foundation.org. Good one, Phil.
Bodhisattvas in action.
There
That's
you go.
great.
That's what it's
I
called.
like it.
Great title.
Yeah.
Dennis,
Okay, this was good. I hope the quality of sound was good for everybody, and
yeah,
they'll learn a lot.
yeah. His accent was rather thick, but I think that it was understandable, and it's a great message. So, Dennis Mundy
Okay.
with Phil Goldberg, Spirit Matters Talk, spiritmatterstalk.com. Till next time,
Okay.
Phil.
Next time.